What's going on, guys? My name's Diggy. Welcome back to my channel. Just before we get into the video today, kind of recapping day one of free agency, I just wanted to say I appreciate all the support lately on all my videos. Make sure if you are watching to like every video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out, shows your support for what I'm doing here. And yeah, I'm just going to try and go over what just took place in a bit of a hectic day one of free agency. It's super early in the morning on Tuesday, but I wanted to make sure that I got this recorded and edited for tomorrow so that I'm not behind on any news. I plan on making a couple of these videos recapping, the following coming days of free agency, but we had a busy day today, so let's not waste any time and get right into it here. This is actually my Instagram account that we're going to be using. It's called Diggy Rebuilds. If you want to go give it a follow. As of right now, I'm purely posting about all of the free agency stuff going on and trades. But I'm also posting about new videos that are going to be going up, kind of interacting with you guys, seeing what you want me to do. So if you want to go give it a follow, it's Diggy Rebuilds. I appreciate that. And so we'll start talking about free agents now. Bit of a hectic day, bit of a busy day, but it was kind of to be expected on the first day of legal tampering. And for those of you that don't know what that means, it essentially means that teams are now allowed to talk to prospective free agents, and there's no penalty for doing so. Obviously, if you were to do it before today, there would be a penalty and there would be a big conflict of interest. Trying to land a free agent prior to, them being able to talk to their own teams first and what they want to do in their particular situation. But enough of that. Let's actually get into the players here. Starting off with Joe Tunney, he got franchise tagged by the New England Patriots. Ultimately, I think it's a good move. I don't know if they can afford to let him go at this point. I think if you're going to try and get Brady back to the team, you have to have Joe Tunney there in front of him, or else he's just going to bail completely because you're not willing to re-sign a guy that he needs to have in front of him to make him feel safe, to have that protection. So we're going to move on, not too much time there on that one. Another one that came in relatively early on in the day, Kirk Cousins got re-signed to a 2-year extension by the Vikings. I don't really have any problem with this one other than the fact that I just don't believe in Kirk Cousins as a quarterback. I think the team in Minnesota has always been great around him, but I don't always have faith in him. I think he's had kind of an embarrassment of riches in terms of weapons, as well as good offensive line play and obviously a great defense. So I think he's more of a good system quarterback. I saw a post today saying that Kirk Cousins is a top 10 quarterback. I personally don't think so. I think he's in the top half of the league, but I wouldn't put him as a top 10 quarterback. I think if you put a lot of quarterbacks in the situation he has at Minnesota and has had in the past couple years that he's been there, I think a lot of quarterbacks would thrive. So I don't blame the Vikings for wanting to give him an extension on his contract. He led him to an 11-6 or 11-5 record, so it makes a lot of sense that they would want to go ahead and do that. All right, guys, so we're here with Bradley Roby now. Obviously getting a new contract from the Houston Texans, who he played with last year. 3-year deal, $36 million. I think this works out for both parties here. Obviously got cut off mid-season due to a hamstring injury, but in the time that he did have on the field, he still managed 2 picks and a sack, so he was somewhat productive in that regard, but they definitely need corners in Houston, so it makes sense to make sure that they lock down one of their own for a couple more years. Next news, now there was a lot of rumors that Devin McCourty would actually be leaving the Patriots. Some were rumoring him to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Others were saying that he might go to Cleveland. I kind of foresaw that he was going to be staying in New England. I kind of figured with his brother being there and stuff like that, it just made the most sense that he would just stay put. And he ended up signing a 2-year, $23 million extension. Now he's 32 years old, so obviously the 2 years you're hoping that he's able to hold on for a couple more seasons, make sure his body holds up and stuff like that. He's not going to be a long-term, guy for the future and stuff like that for obvious reasons, but he's a big part of your defense, and a big reason why you were so good last year was because of your secondary. So it makes sense to bring him back here. Kansas City Chiefs also, unsurprisingly, franchise tagged Chris Jones. Chris Jones is like one of my favorite players in the NFL, to be perfectly honest. He's so good on the interior. He's an absolute beast. He got franchise tagged, which is kind of annoying, and I know he's talked about it in the past where he would like a long-term extension, but as you can also see here, he only played 13 games due to a groin issue, so there's precedent for injury concerns and stuff like that, but I think this guy is a can't-miss talent. I don't believe this is a sign-and-trade kind of deal. I know there have been rumors about potentially having him franchise tagged and then traded, but I just think Chris Jones is too solid of an asset in the middle for Kansas City to give up on. And with all the high-powered offense that they have to have guys on defense. So I think this makes a lot of sense for them, and I think it's ultimately the right move. All right, so this is one of the bigger cuts that we've seen. There were quite a few early on in the day, but it kind of simmered out as more guys were getting signed. But Devonta Freeman and Desmond Trufant got cut by the Falcons today, and I cannot say this enough. Devonta Freeman is not a good running back. I personally have watched him for the last 3 or 4 seasons, and it seems like every time he's either dealing with an injury, on injured reserve, or coming off of an injury. And, I keep hearing people saying, he's got potential, he's there's still something there. We can just dig it out of him. It's not the case. He got way too overpaid with his 5-year contract, which is, kind of looking like a Todd Gurley kind of contract where, you sign these running backs when they're 25, 26. They're already technically past their prime statistically, and then they end up fizzling out and you're in a bad money spot on a position that ultimately is one of the least important positions in the game of football. So to me, this was a good move by them. It was a proactive move by them by cutting him. It made a lot of sense to me. And then in regards to Desmond Trufant, I mean, people will say like, oh, he had 4 picks last year. He was great last year and stuff like that. I just don't see it, to be perfectly honest. He's 28 years old as well, which means that even if you're looking to re-sign him, you probably don't want to commit to another 3 or 4 years. You probably want it down to around 1 or 2. And ultimately, I think the reasoning behind cutting him was probably because they couldn't work something out with him on a shorter term deal. He probably wants 3 or 4 years. He knows that he got 4 interceptions last year, and he's coming off of a surgery. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but ultimately, I think a team will go after him and pursue him on a 3 or 4 year deal. And I just ultimately don't think the Falcons are there. I think they're probably heading for a pretty significant rebuild. So I think ultimately some people thought this was a questionable call. I thought it was a great call for them. Not a shocker for me on this one. Dak Prescott getting franchise tagged by the Cowboys. I don't really want to touch on it too long because it's been covered so much by all the media. Essentially, Dak and the Cowboys met a couple of times. They gave him an offer between Goff and Wentz, which is a fairly significant amount of money. But the problem was on the length of the contract. I'm assuming the Cowboys wanted probably 2 years, maybe 3. And I'm assuming Dak probably wanted a 5, 6, 7 year deal. It's gotten covered so much that I don't even really want to talk about it, but he got franchise tagged. I have another Cowboys notification later on in the video, which if you track today, you know what's coming, but $31.5 million roughly on the cap there, or on the franchise tag there. So ultimately they can still work out a long-term contract during this offseason. So if that manages to happen, great. But if not, Dak will be playing under the tag for next year. All right, so a couple of low-key signings as well. The Green Bay Packers made 2 moves kind of in quick succession of one another. Rickey Wagner and Christian Kirksey were 2 guys that were cut right before the legal tampering was allowed. And Wagner got cut by the Lions. He's an offensive tackle. I think for them in this spot, I think they're worried about Brian Bulaga leaving. I know Brian Bulaga has voiced the fact that he does indeed want to stay in Green Bay, but I think Rickey Wagner is kind of an insurance piece for them if Bulaga decides to get a bigger contract elsewhere and pursue that. So I think this is ultimately a safety net for them. All right, so Christian Kirksey here, another kind of low-key signing by the Packers. A 2-year, $13 million deal. I guess things just weren't working out in Cleveland for him. To be perfectly honest, probably couldn't unlock a lot of his potential there. And then, for Green Bay, probably the potential of losing Blake Martinez is on their minds, so they bring in a linebacker just to make sure that they're short up there at that position and that there's not going to be too many holes for them at the end of free agency. On to the next one. This one happened relatively early on in the day, but Anthony Harris getting franchise tagged by the Minnesota Vikings. I think ultimately this was a great move for them. I don't think that they could afford to let him go at this point with all the problems in their secondary already. He had an unbelievable season for them and was kind of the anchor of that secondary for them. So I think they needed to bring him back. I think ultimately it was a really good call on management's part to franchise tag him and not sign him to a long-term deal. I'm assuming he probably went into free agency expecting a longer-term deal. And I think that's ultimately why a lot of people had him going elsewhere, was because they didn't think Minnesota was going to franchise tag him, and they figured he would just probably leave for a 3 or 4 year deal. But Minnesota uses their franchise tag on him. I think it was a great move. Standout season last year with 6 interceptions. Now he's 28, so that's a little bit concerning that he's already a little bit on the other side of his prime, but he's gotten better every single year since he's come into the league as an undrafted free agent. So, kudos to him for getting his bag as an undrafted guy. That's awesome to see. And I think it was a great move by them in the end. All right, guys, so a bit of a controversial one up next. It's the Tennessee Titans franchise tagging Derrick Henry. I also want to shout out, I don't know where this came from, but this cartoon of Derrick Henry looks awesome, so I decided I had to post it. But anyways, bit of a controversy because we all know Ryan Tannehill got a pretty handsome extension and Derrick Henry only got the franchise tag. Most people were a little bit upset by that the guy who essentially pulled the load for that team most of the season, only managed to get a single year of good money as opposed to an extended period of time of money and guaranteed money. I know Tyrann Mathieu had a tweet about it and stuff like that. But, I think ultimately they were kind of in a weird cap space where they knew they had to franchise tag either Henry or Tannehill. Tannehill just costs way more to franchise tag for the single year. I think it probably would have been the more correct decision at the end of the day. But they went to franchise tag Derrick Henry at the end of the day. And, it's not a bad move. They brought back both their guys. So it is what it is. That team's going to look relatively similar to what they looked like this past season, so I think it's ultimately the right call. All right, so for this one, this is really nothing new. AJ Green getting franchise tagged by the Cincinnati Bengals. There were obviously rumors about Joe Burrow demanding that they franchise tag AJ Green so that he can have him for next season. I kind of believe it, but yeah, there was obviously that tweet that AJ Green made about just give me a long-term deal or let me go. He didn't get either of those things. He got the franchise tag, so maybe he can come back for a really good 2020 campaign with Joe Burrow. Maybe not, but he's staying in Cincinnati for at least one more season. Another one that everyone saw coming was Leonard Williams getting franchise tagged by the Giants. There were some rumors beforehand that they had come to an extension, and then they didn't, and they were actually really far apart on contract negotiations. So I think, they made the trade for him around the midseason mark with the Jets. You can't let him walk after giving up picks for him. You have to franchise tag him. I think they made the right call. Hopefully, I've never been a huge fan of Leonard Williams, but I really hope that his production starts to go up at some point because I think he can be a great player. All right, so we're making our way through these ones that everyone kind of expected to happen. Shaq Barrett gets franchise tagged by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The tag is worth $15.8 million. I think you have to franchise tag him in this situation. You can't let a guy walk who just came off a 19.5 sack season. It's kind of amazing that he couldn't find a spot in that Denver rotation of edge rushers and had to come to Tampa Bay to really show his talents. But he's kind of a one-hit wonder in my opinion. I don't think he'll have anywhere close to the production of this season next year. So I think ultimately the franchise tag is the right call in this scenario. It's kind of a prove-it franchise tag. If he has another unbelievable season next year, you give him a long-term extension, and that's that. All right, guys, so for the next one, I'm about to explain the transition tag for those of you who don't know what that means. The transition tag is essentially exactly the same as the franchise tag, except for that it allows the player to still field offers from other teams, and it gives the right to the Arizona Cardinals to match any of those incoming offers from other franchises. So Arizona obviously put the transition tag on Kenyon Drake today. Now Kenyon Drake can still discuss other contracts with other franchises, and it allows the Cardinals to mull over a potential offer from another team and decide whether they want to match it or not. And if they don't, they get no compensation back. If they match it, then he is forced to sign with the Cardinals for whatever that contract is. All right, so we're finally here in some of the moves that people weren't expecting kind of the more free agent pool that we were expecting to shift teams, as opposed to the guys who were kind of just expected to get franchise tagged. But Eric Flowers gets picked up here on a 3-year, $30 million deal with the Miami Dolphins. It's funny. On almost every report I've seen, he was still listed as an offensive tackle, despite the fact that he played guard with the Redskins. And the reason why he was on the Redskins was because he got traded from the Giants to the Redskins because he played tackle for the Giants and he was terrible. Now, he went into the Redskins, played some offensive guard, and was amazing. So Miami Dolphins pounced on that and managed to sign him to a pretty good contract, in my opinion. I know he's not too old. I believe he's only 26. And Miami's just shoring up their offensive line. It makes a lot of sense that they would want to do that. And quite honestly, they didn't have a lot to work with in the beginning, so it's a start. All right, so the next one, I kind of expected this to be happening, but I wasn't sure if it was going to be the case. Basically, the Pittsburgh Steelers franchise tagged Bud Dupree. He had a bit of a breakout season with 11.5 sacks this year. I don't think he had ever had over 3 in a season, so this was like really a breakout campaign for him. I think a lot of people were expecting him to move off of the Steelers, but in actuality, I guess they value the fact that they have 2 pretty good edge rushers in TJ Watt and Bud Dupree on either side, so figure they keep that tandem together. TJ Watt, requires so much attention. Maybe it allows Bud Dupree to thrive on the other side. But yeah, they bring back that dangerous duo, and hopefully he can continue his production next season. So this was the first one where when the news broke about it, I was actually genuinely starting to get into that free agency mood, the excitement of seeing some of these players who you've gotten accustomed to, watching them in the same jersey every single season. And yeah, I kind of have a soft spot for tight ends in my heart. It's what I played when I played football. But yeah, Austin Hooper signs a pretty significant 4-year, $44 million deal with the Cleveland Browns, making him the highest paid tight end in the NFL. To be perfectly honest on this one, I have my questions on it. Austin Hooper is a fantastic player, don't get me wrong. I think he can make a huge impact on this team as someone who can stretch the field but also be there for Baker Mayfield as a playmaker when he's panicking and needs to get rid of the football. However, you still have guys like Rickey Seals-Jones, David Njoku. Obviously, Njoku got hurt last season with a pretty gruesome injury. But, you still had 2 guys there that were relatively young. Njoku, I thought, was a great player, an up-and-coming guy as a tight end. And, yeah, now you've kind of set him back in his progression and probably will look to move off of him with the new signing long-term of Austin Hooper. So it's kind of a questionable one in my eyes. I don't know if they needed to make this move. I thought there were other teams that were way more desperate for a tight end that would have come in and picked him up. But yeah, he ends up going to the Cleveland Browns. So it's an interesting one. I don't know if they maybe brought him in for his combination of blocking and catching, but it's definitely an interesting one. So then we had the absolute bombshell dropped on us, which was that Deandre Hopkins, still crazy to say that he actually got traded, Deandre Hopkins and a 4th-round pick for David Johnson from the Cardinals, who, keep in mind, did not play a whole lot last season and has struggled mightily with injury concerns, a 2nd-round pick, a 4th-round pick in 2021, and that is it. That is the whole trade. DeAndre Hopkins and a 4th for David Johnson, a 2nd and a 4th. There has been so much backlash by the Texans community, and I quite honestly don't blame them. You are trading one of the best receivers, definitely top 5, if not top 3 in the NFL, in the middle of his prime, for not even a 1st-round pick. I was looking back on previous wide receivers who had been traded for 1st-round picks, and it's pretty unbelievable, but one name that stands out to me is that Brandon Cooks got traded twice on 2 separate occasions for 1st-round picks, and the Texans didn't manage to get a 1st-round pick for DeAndre Hopkins. Honestly, I don't even know if this trade would have been worth it if they had sent him over in exchange for 2 1st-round picks from the Cardinals. Like, this was an unprecedented trade. Not to mention, David Johnson really isn't a world beater. Had you had said this trade was going down 3 years ago, then maybe people would have been like, oh, that's not too bad. But David Johnson has struggled mightily lately with injuries. He missed a whole season due to a wrist injury, and then he was dealing with a multitude of issues this season, eventually leading to the emergence of Kenyon Drake. So this was an absolutely mind-blowing deal that went down. Probably going to be discussing it in the NFL for a long time to come. But this one was a shocker. This one was a huge shocker. And now the Cardinals can't go receiver in the first round of the draft because now they have one of the best receivers and an established one in the NFL already. So huge loss for the Texans. Terrible day for the Texans all around, in my opinion. They had a terrible day. But a huge win for the Cardinals, in my opinion. And that's not biased because I'm a Cardinals fan. That is just purely facts. If your team got DeAndre Hopkins, you would be as happy as I am too. So this one wasn't surprising to me at all either. Eric Armstead agreeing on a 5-year, $85 million deal with the San Francisco 49ers. He remains there on the team that just went to a Super Bowl. I think this makes a lot of sense. I think they love their versatility on their defensive line, how they can move and shift guys around, to scheme out, to, match up on offensive sets, purely positionally, where they are in the field, whatever it comes to, they have the versatility on the defensive line to match up with whatever the offense throws at them. And it's not surprising that they want to bring back one of their most versatile rushers in the game. He can stretch it out to the outside. He can come off the edge. He can play inside at D-tackle. He's one of the most interesting, fun players in the league right now, and it makes a lot of sense that they brought him back on a pretty large contract. So obviously, in the fallout of losing Austin Hooper, the Atlanta Falcons had a fairly significant hole at their tight end position. So they managed to pull off a trade with the Baltimore Ravens to acquire Hayden Hurst, who was a first-round pick for them, I believe in 2017. Yeah, he, was kind of trapped in the depth charts behind Mark Andrews, who had like an unbelievable emergence as a rookie. And then also Nick Boyle, who's a guy who's been on the Baltimore Ravens for a while now. I think the reason why Hayden Hurst ultimately got shipped off was because he was kind of just the odd man out. He was new but not developing and wasn't old enough to know the playbook inside and out and, just add that different veteran element to the team. So I think ultimately it was a pretty good pickup by the Falcons, only having to give up a second-round pick and a fifth, and you're getting back him and a fourth. So first-round value and a fourth for a second and a fifth at a position of need. Maybe you bring in Hurst and he finally has the ability to break out with no one else really vying for his position as the starting tight end. So I think it was a good move for both teams. You're kind of addressing a need on one side, and then if you're the Baltimore Ravens, you add an extra pick to your arsenal to maybe use another deal, or you just take it as the pick that it is and, add a good player, because the second round, there's going to be tons of good players left. So I like this move for both teams. All right, so another guy who kind of never really managed to live up to his full potential was Shaq Lawson, playing for the Buffalo Bills. He is kind of an interesting player. He's an edge rusher who got taken in the first round by them out of Clemson. Kind of never really got his time to shine. He still kind of played behind Jerry Hughes, even though Jerry Hughes is a million years old. But he just never really had his opportunity in this defense. And so anyways, Miami managed to pry him away from the Bills and signed him to a 3-year, $30 million deal. Shaq Lawson's still pretty young. I think he's only 25 right now. It's an interesting move in the sense that he hasn't really proven himself in any real regard yet. And to sign him to a 3-year, $30 million deal is pretty big, but if you are Miami, you're looking for those kinds of players who are kind of flying under the radar. It makes sense for them. Do I think it was the best move that they could have made? Probably not, but they are flush with cash, so might as well fork over some dollar bills to Shaq Lawson. All right, so another pretty interesting signing in my opinion. I think Nick Kwiatkowski was one of the most underrated free agents on the market. Just no one really talking about him, but every time I turned on a Bears game, he was all over the field. So I personally like this guy a lot. I think this is a great signing by the Las Vegas Raiders. I think they got him on a really, really nice deal as well. 3 years, $21 million. You're not breaking the bank for him. I think there was a rumor that the market for him was really starting to heat up once today's tampering opened. And yeah, I think the Vegas Raiders made a really, really great move here. They brought in a guy who can add value to their team for an entire 3 years, in my opinion. And for only $21 million, that's a pretty solid steal, in my opinion. So I think that was a good move by them. Shore up that linebacking core. You just lost Tahir Whitehead. This makes all the sense in the world to me. All right, so another rather unsurprising one, but the Dallas Cowboys came to an agreement with restricted free agent Blake Jarwin on a 3-year, $24.25 million deal. Obviously, you have a huge hole at tight end. Jason Witten came out of the booth to play for you this season, but he's probably was just as bad on the field as he was in the booth. But now you get your guy back. He's, I believe, pretty young, still only 26, I'm fairly certain. So, he's still got, good amount of gas left in the tank, 3-year deal. I don't expect him to have the receiving acumen akin to a guy like Jason Witten when he was in his heyday, but I think he brings a good dynamic of athleticism, blocking, and catching. I know he's got some speed to him as well, so I think he's a fun player. I think he just needs an opportunity to be more involved in the offense, and I think this is kind of a testament to them saying, hey, we're moving forward with you as our starting tight end. We have faith in you. Here you go. Here's your contract. Here's your money. Let's see it on the field now. This one for me is kind of a no-brainer here. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have agreed to a deal with Jason Pierre-Paul, 2 years, $27 million. He's 31 years old. He's not going to get a 4 or 5 year deal at this point in his career. I think he knows that. He had 8.5 sacks last year, which is great. You're still getting production. You put him on the other side of Shaq Barrett. I can understand why you don't really want to break that tandem apart. It makes perfect sense to me. You're not fully breaking the bank. I think $27 million is a little steep, but for an edge rusher in the NFL, that's pretty much, as basic as it gets, as average as it gets these days for an edge rusher in the NFL. So it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't want to talk about this one too long. This was a move that I absolutely loved for both teams. I cannot stress this enough. The Indianapolis Colts were super desperate for defensive tackle. It's continuously why I kept mocking Javon Kinlaw into their spot at number 13. I always thought that they were looking defensive line. San Francisco sent DeForest Buckner, their defensive tackle, in exchange for the 13th overall pick. I like how it was just a 1-to-1 swap. It just felt so clean in that regard. DeForest Buckner is an established, unbelievable interior defensive lineman. He can stop the run. He can apply pressure to the quarterback, push double teams into your lap. He's an unbelievable player, freakishly athletic, freakishly large human being. And yeah, Indianapolis just gets a straight up baller. And then if you're San Francisco in this position, it gives you the flexibility in a spot where you know that you're pretty strapped with talent all across your defensive line. So, in this spot, you might as well get the flexibility to pick whoever you want at number 13. Maybe it is a quarterback with all the rumors swirling about not having faith in Jimmy G and stuff like that. Not that I actually think that's going to happen, but crazier things have happened. But I think realistically, you're looking at this from their perspective and you're saying, okay, we lose a very good young player, but now it gives us the flexibility to address another need that might be more of a priority than our defensive line, which is already unbelievable. So, in my opinion, I think it works out for both squads. Good deal, clean trade. I like it a lot. All right, so the next one that we had was the Jack Conklin move from the Titans to the Browns. I thought this was really a 2-team race, maybe 3 if you included the Titans in it, but I really didn't think he was going to re-sign with them. But I thought ultimately it was coming down to the Jets and the Browns. Obviously, the Browns desperately need to address offensive line on both sides of the football. Everyone's mocking them to take a offensive tackle in this upcoming draft. I think you plant Jack Conklin on your right side. I think you plug whoever you want to draft in that left side, and you've got your reestablished offensive line in virtually one offseason. So I think it's a great move for them. 3-year deal, $42 million. I know he's still pretty young at only 26, so you sign him for 3 years. He runs out his contract. If he's still a very solid player, you can extend him another 3 years because he's an offensive lineman. So good move for the Browns. And yeah, tough loss for the Jets who missed out on him. So after complimenting the Browns on a good move to bring in Jack Conklin, I'm going to absolutely rip on them for bringing in Case Keenum on a 3-year, $18 million contract. Number one, such a waste of money. And, you know, I understand that Baker Mayfield can have his ups and downs, and you're probably worried, if I'm assuming this correctly, but I'm assuming that they expect to be pretty good next season. And I think that they know if Baker Mayfield goes down that they don't have anyone to back him up that's sufficient. And I think a lot of teams looked at the situation with what happened in New Orleans this season, where Teddy Bridgewater took over and he went perfect in his 5 or 6 games that he played with them. So I think they're just panicking and bringing in a veteran quarterback to back him up, just in case of an injury or whatever godforsaken thing he manages to do that garners a suspension from the team or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, I think it was a pretty significant overpay. I think they also gave him far too many years. You probably could have gotten him on a 1 or 2 year deal for virtually the same money, but I don't know. It just felt like they were tying up unnecessary money when they didn't have to. But, you know, now you have a backup quarterback behind Baker. I personally love talking about offensive line, so this one was a really fun one for me. Graham Glasgow leaves the Detroit Lions to join the Denver Broncos. I really like what Denver's doing to their team right now, to be perfectly honest. I think they've actually got quite a good direction in front of them. So the reason behind this signing was because they couldn't manage to agree on a contract with Connor McGovern, who's their current center. So they went out and they got a guy like Graham Glasgow, and now they're just going to let their guy, Connor McGovern, walk in free agency. But a 4-year, $44 million deal. I mean, Graham Glasgow is an absolute unbelievable player. I was looking at something earlier today where he only had 4 penalties all season last year, and he virtually played every single offensive snap. So he's clearly an asset to have. He'll probably move in right to that center position, try and build a relationship with Drew Lock for them. I think it was a great move for them, shore up that offensive line if they can. And it works out for me. This was also a fairly significant one. I think we all kind of assumed that James Bradberry probably wouldn't be returning. The Giants swoop in, make the necessary deal to pick up the corner that they desperately need. You know, he's only 26 years old. You get him for 3 years through his prime, $45 million contract. It's a bit of a steep contract, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're expecting to have him have the season that he had just this last season, then I think ultimately it's worth paying every penny for that. You know, you're essentially paying for a number 1 corner on your team. You'd rather make sure you get him and overpay him than underpay him and not get him. So I think this is a necessary move for the Giants. So this one for me was personally a huge surprise. I kind of had Byron Jones going to either the Raiders or the Eagles. I think the majority of the people who were predicting free agency had him going to the Eagles, just because everyone knows how depleted the Eagles secondary was and just how, you know, on and off performing they were. So I think everyone wanted to see Byron Jones come into that secondary and shore it all up. But lo and behold, the big spenders of free agency day one, the Miami Dolphins, swooped in with a 5-year, $82.5 million contract, making him the highest paid corner in the league. Yeah, they really made a splash today, and I don't blame them. They had a ton of cap space, pretty much because they did a relatively good job in their rebuild that we've seen thus far. But, you know, now they have Xavier Howard and Byron Jones on either side, 2 of the top corners in the league and 2 of the highest paid corners in the league. So obviously you don't want to see any negatives come out of free agency, but, you know, for that amount of money, they better perform. So that's all I'm going to say for the Miami Dolphins. So another rather interesting signing that took place was that Michael Brockers left the Los Angeles Rams. I kind of predicted that he would stay with the Rams. I thought that he adds a fun dynamic with Aaron Donald. He's somewhat of a hybrid player. He can play in a 4-3 or a 3-4, but he ends up getting pried away by the Baltimore Ravens on a 3-year, $30 million deal. Now they're losing Michael Pierce, which is a huge loss for them, but they bring in Calais Campbell in that trade that happened with the Jaguars yesterday or the day before, and now they bring in a guy like Michael Brockers, who's a little bit younger than Calais Campbell, obviously. But yeah, they're really shoring up that defensive line, so they must think that they've still got a good chance to go to the Super Bowl. Obviously, you're coming off a season with the reigning MVP, and as good as you were, I don't think they'll be as good as that this past season next year, but bringing in some defensive line definitely helps. All right, so potentially candidate for the worst signing of the day, the Chicago Bears bring in veteran tight end Jimmy Graham on a 2-year, $16 million deal. I personally thought Jimmy Graham should have hung up his cleats after this past season. He's never really been a guy who's managed to keep a super clean bill of health. And, obviously with his age where he is at right now, he just doesn't have 2 more years of production in him. And I think with what happened this past season with Trey Burton and the fact that they just didn't have that dynamic in their offense anymore, I think they were a little bit desperate. I think ultimately they were probably looking at a guy like Austin Hooper, one of those bigger name tight ends on the market, but couldn't afford him or wasn't as interested as other teams. So they settled for a guy like Jimmy Graham. And this was just a disaster. He's not good anymore. He's, to be perfectly honest, I loved him in his day, with Seattle and stuff like that, but he's just not the same player that he once was. And to sign him for a 2-year deal just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. You should have just had it for a 1-year thing, as a bit of a veteran presence in the locker room or whatever you want to call it. But this was just not it for the Bears. All right, so another interesting one that took place was Javon Hargrave left the Steel City to go join the Philadelphia Eagles. He signed a 3-year, $39 million contract. It seemed like the precedent today was 3-year deals hovering in the range of $30 to $40 million for, relatively high, starting defensive or offensive linemen. And Javon Hargrave fits that bill. He's kind of an inconsistent player in Pittsburgh, but he had his moments for sure, and he's been very productive for at least the last season there. So the Eagles swoop in and pick him up, put him either behind or beside Fletcher Cox on your defensive line, and I think you've got a good dynamic there. I know Eagles fans were not happy about this signing. They wanted their corner, they wanted their receiver, and they brought in a defensive tackle. I don't think they should rip on him as much as they have, and inevitably as much as they will. But, he's a good player. He's a solid addition to the team. I like it a lot. Continuing the theme with splashes, a little bit of an overpay, in my opinion, here by the Miami Dolphins, but they get their outside linebacker, Kyle Van Noy, stealing him away from the Patriots, interdivision rivalry, but he signs a 4-year, $51 million deal with them. I'm pretty sure he's 29 at this point. I don't know. This seems like a definite overpay in my opinion. I'm assuming he'll probably not be as good as he was in New England in Miami. But, he's still got Brian Flores there, an ex-Patriot product of the Belichick coaching tree. But, yeah, I don't see this contract really being one to be happy about looking back in hindsight. But, again, they were strapped with cash. They had the flexibility to go out and do a deal like this, so you might as well go out and do it. So I don't blame them for pursuing it, but it seems like an overpay in my opinion. All right, so I don't know about the number on this contract yet. I'm not sure if it's been released. I have to check still, but I know Marcus Mariota has agreed to the terms of a deal with the Las Vegas Raiders. I thought initially this pointed to potentially moving on from Derek Carr, but that has not happened yet. So maybe it isn't that direction. Maybe they're just bringing in Mariota as insurance on Derek Carr. But I think Mariota's an interesting piece. I think he's still got a lot of potential in him. He's very, very young. I think people gave up on him, a little too early, and I personally haven't liked him since he's come into the league. I haven't had a whole lot of faith in him, but I also think the system in Las Vegas, the John Gruden offense, fits his play style better than it did in Tennessee. So I don't think this is an egregious move by them, but I think it makes a lot of sense when you're looking at the perspective of maybe they're looking to move on from Derek Carr potentially, or just making sure that they have a 1-2 punch at the end of the day if Derek Carr ends up getting hurt. So I don't want to spend too much time on this one. New York Jets sign offensive tackle George Fant to a 3-year, $30 million deal, taking him away from the Seattle Seahawks. I personally think this one just screams, we didn't get Jack Conklin. Who's the next best available offensive tackle we can get? And they've landed on George Fant. I would say that they are just looking to desperately find offensive tackle replacements. This also, to me, screams like they're probably going to go offensive tackle at number 11 in the draft if one of those top guys is still available to them at that position. But yeah, I think it's just kind of putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. I don't think George Fant is the answer that the Jets were looking for, but he still is a pretty good addition to their team. Okay, in the most obvious signing of all time, the Lions actively pursued a Patriots defensive player, and they went out and got outside linebacker Jamie Collins on a 3-year, $30 million deal. This one's very similar to me in the Kyle Van Noy deal. I think personally that they're two aging linebackers that play really, really well in the Belichick system, and hence it's not surprising that one is going to Brian Flores down in Miami and the other one's going to Matt Patricia up in Detroit. So this one just screams Matt Patricia got along pretty well with Jamie Collins when he was in the Patriots system, when he was coaching there. Now he wants him back in Detroit. 3-year deal. It's not egregious. It's not a huge overpay, and it's not a huge length, but I don't know. I just don't see. They almost never work out when they come over from New England to another team, even if that team has one of the coaches from the Belichick coaching tree. It just never really works out. This exact situation happened with Jamie Collins when the Patriots got rid of him, sent him to Cleveland. He was terrible in Cleveland, so they sent him back to the Patriots, and then he's unbelievable again to the point where he gets a 3-year, $30 million deal from the Lions. So to me, I don't know if this one works out, but at least you're stealing another defensive player away from the Patriots, right? This one was a bit of a throwaway one, but I wanted to include it because I think the Buffalo Bills are going to be an amazingly fun team next year, and people should have more respect for that franchise that they're building up there in Buffalo. For most of you, I'm from Toronto, so a little bit south of me. But the Buffalo Bills and A.J. Klein have agreed on a 3-year, $18 million deal. I think this is just purely filling out a depth chart at linebacker. I think they're probably a little bit paranoid about the health of Tremaine Edmonds and stuff like that. Matt Milano is included in that as well. So I think this is just kind of insurance on those guys if they end up getting hurt or something like that. It's not an egregious contract length. It's not an egregious overpay at only $18 million. They had the cap money to make sure that this wasn't a huge dent in what they wanted to do for the rest of the day. So I think it was a perfect signing for them, and it made a lot of sense. In classic Seattle Seahawks fashion, they were hyped up to make a bunch of really impactful moves, and they virtually did nothing on day one of free agency, but they did sign their defensive tackle Jarran Reed to a 2-year, $23 million deal. I personally like this deal a lot. I think he's still got a lot more to offer. I think he's still very young. And yeah, 2 years, $23 million. I think the money's a little bit high, but I think the contract length is proper and good for them. And it allows them to still have flexibility for other positional players, other things to do in free agency. So I think you just get your guy back and you're happy with it at the end of the day. And then another very significant trade. This one was also very, very, very sudden, and I think people were expecting it because earlier in the day, Stephon Diggs made a tweet saying like the end is nigh, essentially. And then people were calling him out saying like, oh, you always say that and then they never do move you. And then he was like, no, this time it's legit. And then sure enough, a couple hours later, the news breaks that they had sent him and a 7th-round pick to the Buffalo Bills in exchange for their first-round pick, a 5th, a 6th from 2020, and a 4th from 2021. A lot of people were saying that's a lot of picks by the Bills to give up. I personally think the value makes a lot of sense. You're looking at a late 20 pick, for a wild card team last season. There's really not a ton of value, and statistically, you're really unlikely to hit on a great player, even in that late first round. So, I think you go out and you get a receiver. I don't think you take the chance on a receiver from the draft, a rookie coming in. You say, we've got this guy who's disgruntled with Minnesota. He doesn't like what's going on over there. We can probably get him at the smallest price we can ever right now. So, and we know how good he is. We know how established he is in the league. I think it makes a lot of sense for the Bills. I think they did the absolute right thing. And they traded out of their first-round pick, which isn't super high as it is. It's only number 22 right now. And you get a receiver who's obviously proven himself to be a Pro Bowl caliber person. So, as I kind of hinted at when I was going over the Dak Prescott franchise tag, here was the big news out of Dallas. The Dallas Cowboys have reached an agreement with Amari Cooper for a 5-year, $100 million deal. This one it totally made sense to me. I never thought for a second that Amari Cooper would leave. He's mentioned on multiple occasions how much he likes Dallas and wants to stay in Dallas. There was also a report that came out literally minutes after the news broke that he had signed a new deal that the Redskins had actively pursued him hardcore with a huge offer on the table, and he chose to decline it in favor of signing for less money with the Dallas Cowboys. So I think it's kind of a testament to, how much the Cowboys mean to Amari Cooper in the sense that they kind of gave him a second shot on his career after coming out of Oakland and stuff like that. Yeah, I think this one was just kind of written in the stars from the beginning, that they were going to manage to work out how to get Dak and Amari back for next year. I think everyone kind of figured the Dak deal probably would have gotten done and then Amari Cooper would have been franchise tagged, but it happened the opposite way. But at the end of the day, they are getting their guys back for the 2020 season. So this one was a very interesting one that only happened a couple of hours ago, late at night here in Toronto. But the Washington Redskins re-signed, quote unquote, re-signed Kendall Fuller. Yeah, they actually traded him in 2018 for Alex Smith, and they traded him to the Chiefs. And yeah, he was a pending free agent this season. I think the Chiefs knew that they couldn't re-sign him because everyone knows that they have to give Mahomes one of the biggest contracts of all time, if not probably the biggest contract football has ever seen next year. So I think they knew that they couldn't afford to bring back Kendall Fuller. So he goes in free agency. And I think this was a great move by the Redskins. They obviously lost Josh Norman to the Bills earlier in free agency. I mean, it's pretty obvious that he's clearly a lot younger than Josh Norman was. He's clearly in his prime or just now hitting it at only 25 years old. And it's kind of funny that he got traded by the Redskins and then said, you know what, hey, I'm going to give this franchise another shot and re-sign with them. And that's pretty cool. 4-year, $40 million deal for him. I think a very reasonable contract, honestly, like considering that's half of what Byron Jones got. And I don't put them too far apart. I think Kendall Fuller's more of a slot guy than Byron Jones. But honestly, I think this one was a great deal for the Redskins. All right, so this one also came out pretty late at night here. Mario Addison reached a 3-year agreement with the Buffalo Bills. I don't know the figures in terms of money on this yet. I don't know if that's been released to the public. But yeah, I mean, veteran presence, you're bringing him in for that reason. I think a 3-year deal was a little bit too long, but if he manages to keep up his consistent play, then I think it's a great deal for the Bills and it makes a lot of sense. All right, so the next deal we have is DeAndre Hopkins' replacement on the Texans, which is, of course, one of the best receivers in the NFL right now, Randall Cobb. So I think we all know that that's not true, but he signs a 3-year, $27 million deal with the Houston Texans. I don't know who had a brain aneurysm in the Texans organization today. I saw this really funny post on Instagram saying that this is one of the dangers that comes with working from home, that you can just trade DeAndre Hopkins like that. But I don't know what on earth they were doing. Obviously, Randall Cobb had a bit of a resurgence with the Dallas Cowboys this past season. But he's just a very old receiver. He doesn't need a 3-year contract. You probably could have given him a 1 or 2 year deal. You knew that the Cowboys couldn't retain him. You probably knew that there wasn't a huge market for him, and yet you go out and you spend $27 million on a 30-year-old wide receiver who's probably not going to make it all 16 games for the next 3 years. That's almost guaranteed. So this is another questionable call by the Texans, in my opinion. All right, guys, so this is my final one for the video. I apologize for not getting through every single transaction that went down today. If you're upset by any of the signings that I did miss, make sure you're dropping them in the comments. I'll cover them in my next video. Probably another one coming tomorrow. You'll be seeing this on Tuesday. There will probably be a Wednesday video. There will probably be a Thursday video. I'm assuming that these free agency signings are not going to stop all of a sudden. They're going to keep rolling, so I'm going to keep making videos covering them. But this is my last one for the video today. Blake Martinez, the New York Giants signed him to a 3-year, $30 million contract. I think this move screams we're drafting Isaiah Simmons. And that might sound weird because Blake Martinez and Isaiah Simmons are both linebackers. But I think, honestly, Blake Martinez is a tackling machine and is great against the run, but is terrible in pass coverage. I think if you're going to pair him along anyone, it should be a super versatile guy like Isaiah Simmons, who can then go and cover tight ends, play zone coverage, play man-to-man on even slot receivers and stuff like that. He's got the speed, he's got the size to do it. I think this just screams that they're taking Isaiah Simmons. I hope it doesn't deter them from taking him, because I think he fits really well in what they're doing over there. But Blake Martinez, absolute tackling machine. Guy plays the run like no one else. Pretty significant loss for the Green Bay Packer defense, especially up the middle. Yeah, I think this works out really well for the Giants. They had to address linebacker in every way that they could. They couldn't let it fall to the wayside and just rely on Isaiah Simmons to come in there and just completely shore up that rotation. So I think you bring in Blake Martinez. It's a great move. It's not an egregious contract in any way. And it makes sense to me. So that's it for today's video. Those are all the deals that I've covered. I posted a ton on Instagram today, so if you don't follow me, go follow me. My Insta handle is right there, Diggy Rebuilds. Make sure you look out for the Cardinal. That's kind of my logo or whatever, if you want to call it that. But thank you for watching the video. I will be coming back with more free agency and trade related videos in the future, probably on Wednesday, probably on Thursday as well. All right, so that's it for me, guys. Thank you for watching the video. Make sure you're liking and subscribing to the channel. Drop a comment on any of the signings that you didn't see, or if you have your predictions of your own on guys who haven't been signed yet, make sure you're dropping those in the comments as well. I would very much appreciate that. Have a good day. Peace.